Welcome to the Downers Grove Library. I'm Karen. I'm the adult program coordinator at the library. Thank you very much for being here on this beautiful evening. A couple of quick things. If you hover down at the bottom, you will see something that says Q&A. If you click on that, you will be able to post any questions that you have. However, we are gonna actually wait until the end to try to go through the questions. So, and then also in the chat feature to the right, you can use that too. So, I would like to welcome Tyler St. Clair. He is the outreach manager for Common Cause. They are a nonprofit, non-partisan organization dedicated to voting rights and legislation in Illinois. So we are very happy to have him. And I will turn it over to Tyler.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Karen. Let me get my screen shared here and we will get started. That's a little bit ahead of ourselves. Okay. Okay, good evening, everybody. Again, my name is Tyler St. Clair. I'm the outreach manager with Common Cause Illinois. I'm here with you tonight to give a presentation, talk a little bit about voting in elections, and specifically safe, secure, and accessible elections, protecting the right to vote during the COVID-19 pandemic. Very timely topic, obviously, with everything in the news and everything that's going on, and a lot of work being done behind the scenes to prepare elections for November. So, again, thank you very much, Karen and the Downers Grove Public Library, for having me on. We have a lot of content tonight in this presentation. It's a very content-dense presentation because there's just naturally a lot to talk about. So as Karen mentioned, we'll go through the presentation. If you have any questions that pop up in your mind, go ahead and submit them through the Q&A or through the chat, and we will make sure that we attempt to answer all of them at the end and try to leave about 10 or 15 minutes to do that. So let's dive right in. A quick overview about what we're going to talk about tonight. So first, we're going to start by talking about COVID-19's impact on the primary election in Illinois, right? Sort of set the stage for why so much emphasis was put on vote by mail as a solution to the issues that we saw on March 17th here in the state of Illinois, and that other states saw it in their primaries as well, right? We're going to talk about what is vote by mail. I also just like talking about systems and how they work, but in order to understand the bill here in Illinois and sort of how different states are reacting to the threat that COVID-19 poses to elections, we'll talk about vote by mail as a system and sort of where different states exist on the spectrum of the sort of vote by mail policy realm, right? So talk about that a little bit. We'll talk about disinformation and misinformation. And then we will go to what's happening at the state and federal level. So we'll talk about the legislation that was passed in Illinois, SB 1863, talk a little bit about the federal level, whether it's funding from Congress or the United States Postal Service. Then we'll go to the voter experience, what you can expect to see, whether you vote by mail, whether you vote early, whether you vote in person on election day, whether you vote by drop box. We'll talk about your experience and what you can expect to see come November 3rd. And then again, we'll open up the end of the presentation for any questions that you may have. Okay, so to get us started, COVID-19 and Illinois primary. It really wasn't that long ago that Illinois was faced with tons of uncertainty leading up to March 17th as COVID really started to ramp up here in the United States. So impact on Illinois' primary election. If you read the Chicago Sun-Times, you might recognize this picture. Illinois had its first reported case of COVID-19 on January 24th, when a traveler had recently returned back from Wuhan, China. 6 weeks later, on March 8th, state officials suspected the first case of community transmission. And the next day, on March 9th, Governor J.B. Pritzker issued a disaster proclamation for the state. So, March 17th, Illinois was part of a group of 4 states that were scheduled to hold their primaries on that day, right? So Arizona, Florida, Illinois, and Ohio. These 4 states found themselves in a really precarious situation, particularly in terms of timing, right? So for the primaries that had happened beforehand, COVID-19 hadn't become a serious issue yet in the United States. And for the states after March 17th that were holding primaries, it was sort of a no-brainer to adjust their election practices or to delay their elections to prepare. But so all the states on March 17th, news around COVID-19 and the risk that it posed to public health and elections began to accelerate, leaving many to wonder if we should be holding primary elections at all, and if we did, how we could prepare for the public health risks associated with in-person voting. Ultimately, Illinois decided not to delay the primary, and voters headed out to the polls on March 17th. Out of the 4 states that I mentioned, Ohio was the only state to postpone its primary election that day, with Illinois, Florida, and Arizona still hosting their primary elections on the 17th. Prior to March 17th, election authorities in Illinois, particularly in Chicago and Cook County, reported a number of issues as they prepared to host in-person voting, right? So first, a number of polling locations had to be relocated. For example, previous locations being inside of buildings with high concentrations of at-risk populations, such as nursing homes. Over 170 sites were relocated, and even then, nearly 50 housing facilities for low-income seniors were still used as polling locations on Election Day. In addition to polling places being relocated, many were closed on an emergency basis on the morning of March 17th. So what election officials had seen as an increasingly worrisome trend ended up coming true, right? Large numbers of poll workers who tend to be elderly, or poll workers tend to be elderly, and so a large number of these poll workers just didn't show up with very valid concerns for their health, right? Prior to Election Day, city and county officials were pleading with healthy residents to volunteer as election judges, increasing the pay and waiving training requirements to fill the growing void in personnel. As a result, mass chaos was the norm on Election Day. Hundreds of polling locations were moved or shuttered completely, leaving voters unsure of where they're supposed to cast their ballot. And for those that could find their polling place, long lines and a lack of necessary PPE and cleaning supplies was a noted issue. So all of this happens. People are scared to go vote in person. It deters people at the polls. Because polling places close, you have longer lines at other polling places. So what's the policy solution that we should propose? This is where vote by mail came in, for good reason. Vote by mail in the early days was cited by a lot of proponents as an easy way to give people the chance to vote from the comfort and safety of their own home, right? So whether they were voting from the comfort of their living room, and whether that meant that you had less people showing up to early vote, so you weren't standing in long lines, and there's less congestion on Election Day, vote by mail was sort of seen as the silver bullet, in a manner of speaking, to address some of these concerns after the primary leading into the general election. So let's talk about what vote by mail is as a system and how it works, and sort of dive into how states across the country use it. So casting a ballot by mail, it's a very common practice in the United States even before 2020, obviously with variations. So casting a ballot by absentee actually began during the Civil War, as soldiers were allowed to vote from their battlefield units and have the ballot sent home to be counted. Again, during World War II, this became a major issue. And today we have laws such as the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act and the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act, specifically to address the issue of military service members abroad having the chance to vote. So what started as a system for military and overseas citizens was later applied to non-military citizens if they were sick or traveling. However, it wasn't until the 1980s when California allowed citizens to request absentee ballots freely. It's important to note here, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into this later in the presentation, but it's important to note here that the United States Postal Service plays a huge role in making sure that election information is shipped, that ballot requests are received and returned, and that ballots themselves are received and returned. So, none of this could happen without a functioning postal service, but we'll dive into that a little bit later again. So the process of casting a ballot by mail varies from state to state, but there are some universal issues to consider. So election officials have to consider printing costs, where they get their paper from, the cost of postage, both to and from, and is it prepaid? You have to think about supporting documents in your election mail, such as language requirement documents, a notice of the postage necessary to ship the ballot back, and some other things. These ballots then have to be postmarked by a specific date and received by the election authority. Finally, signatures must be verified, which goes into a signature cure process. And again, we'll dive into that a little bit more later in the presentation. So again, a very common practice here in the United States with some variations. The behind the scenes process can get pretty complicated. So let's dive into some of those different systems that states use. Okay, so who uses vote by mail? In a word, everybody in some form or fashion. So this is a map with data from the Vote at Home Institute, a name you might have heard. And this is pre-COVID-19, I should stipulate, but for the purposes of this presentation, will provide us with plenty of background content. So what you see here is the spectrum that states exist on, right? So you have states in dark blue, which are universal vote by mail states. You have states in the teal color, which are no excuse absentee states with permanent mail ballot options. This sort of seafoam green color you have here are no excuse absentee states. That's the category that Illinois falls into. And finally, the sand color, excuse absentee, which is the second most common form of absentee or mail voting in the United States. So again, as you can see, states exist on a spectrum. There's been a lot of discussion talking about, should states, can or should states transition to universal vote by mail leading up to November. Realistically, there are a few states that might have that opportunity based on where they are currently in their on the spectrum of voting by mail, right? Arizona is one of these states, but a lot of states that transitioned to universal vote by mail did that over a long period of time with very deliberate policymaking and budgetary considerations. It's not something that's easy to ramp up to quickly, but it's a consideration that you have to think about whenever you think about the back-end infrastructure of how these systems are run. So let's go to universal vote by mail. Currently, Colorado, Hawaii, as of this year, Oregon, Utah, and Washington are the only universal vote by mail states in the country, while California is transitioning to this model and plans to have it fully implemented somewhere between 2022 to 2024. Oregon was the first state to adopt a vote by mail bill back in 1998, and it has since increased in popularity, obviously. So let's dive into the specifics. Again, the point that I just made, it's important to note that states that transitioned to universal vote by mail systems did this over a period of time with very deliberate budgeting and policymaking processes designed to implement vote by mail. As an example, Oregon began introducing legislation in the 1980s and didn't pass a universal vote by mail bill until 1998. Another example, Colorado evolved into the model over the course of a decade or so, allowing voters and policymakers to become comfortable with the practice of universal vote by mail. So these states conduct every election by mail. The process looks something like this. Election authorities automatically mail a ballot to every registered voter well before election day, giving voters a window of time to either return their ballot by mail or vote in person. For example, in Washington state, this is about an 18-day period. While a large portion of voters in these states do return their ballots by mail, understandably so, it is important to note that these states still have in-person options to return your ballot, including vote centers and 24-hour ballot drop boxes. According to the Survey of Performance of American Elections, 73% of voters in Colorado, 59% in Oregon, and 65% of voters in Washington returned their ballots to a physical location, such as a drop box or local election office. So even as we think of expanding vote by mail systems in the United States, it's important that we still maintain those physical locations, again, to make sure that voters have plenty of options in the ways that they can return their ballot. So once a ballot is returned, there are a few more steps in the process. First, a ballot envelope is received by the election authority and scanned into a system for verification, typically with automated processing and sorting machines. In Oregon, they have a centralized database which matches both the envelope barcode and signature with their records. This is where the signature verification process begins, where accepted envelopes and envelopes needed further review are separated. Once they're separated into their precincts, they're then opened and processed. And in some states, while ballots are processed before election day, they're not always tallied, which is an important distinction to make. Finally, election day occurs, ballots are tallied and stored, and the results are reported. There is another piece of universal vote by mail where, research has shown over the past couple of years that one of the benefits of universal vote by mail is that there is a modest increase in voter turnout in states that adopt more expansive vote by mail policies. So that's also something to think about as policymakers consider these issues. So the next category that we're going to talk about here is no excuse absentee states. Again, this is the category that Illinois falls into and is the most common form of mail-in voting in America. There are variations across the states to allow for certain groups of voters, for example, voters with disabilities, to automatically enroll in a 5-year permanent absentee ballot system that automatically mails them a ballot for each election over the course of 5 years. They do have to reapply at the end of their cycle. In other areas, localities can determine for themselves if they would like to host an election entirely by mail. North Dakota is one of these. So in these states where counties can opt in to vote by mail, universal vote by mail systems for their elections if they so choose. For these states, early voting periods and in-person voting is still utilized heavily. Voters must request a ballot through their election authority, but no excuse is required. A voter is then mailed their ballot, and the process is very similar to the rest of the universal vote by mail process. Again, though, one of the main differences is infrastructure. While the process is similar, processing ballot envelopes, signature verification, processing ballots, and tallying results, these states tend to lack the broad high level of technology that universal vote by mail states utilize. So maybe instead of a high-speed ballot processor in every locality, an election authority is likely to do it by hand. The signature verification process isn't necessarily automated and is usually handled by election judges. And so this is the back-end disconnect that makes it difficult to quickly scale up an all-mail election system depending on your state. On the map, I'd also included the no excuse absentee permanent mail ballot option category. Again, these are states that allow citizens to opt in to automatically receive a mail ballot for each election. These states, including California, Virginia, Arizona, Montana, and a few others, are, again, likely the states with the most capacity to transition to universal vote by mail, again, as California plans to do over the next few years. So the final category we're going to talk about here is excuse absentee. This is the second most common form of mail voting in the United States and considered the most restrictive in terms of vote by mail, right? So in these states, voters must provide an excuse as to why they cannot vote in person on or before election day. These states also tend to have lower levels of absentee ballots cast. Most of the process in North is done by hand with election officials and judges. It's important to note here, I had mentioned that a lot of states have adopted a lot of different changes in reforms to prepare for November. There are many states who are excuse absentee states that have changed or relaxed some of these rules, right? So for example, Kentucky is known to have fairly restrictive voting laws. For their primary, however, every voter was provided with an automatic excuse to vote absentee. I believe it was something along the lines of public health. And they would not need a witness signature to validate their ballot. So a lot of states, understandably, are adopting reforms that make their elections much easier to participate in, much more accessible. So that's an overview of sort of the systems aspect of voting by mail and gives you a pretty good idea of where different states exist along that spectrum and how, or what the steps they might need to take are to prepare themselves for November. So another important thing to talk about here is disinformation around voting by mail. If you have watched the news or read the paper or been on Twitter or Facebook, you have likely have read something about disinformation and misinformation around voting by mail. This is one of my favorite political cartoons. if you remember the court case from North Carolina's 9th District from a few years back. As you probably heard, President Trump has been making multiple claims about voting by mail, but a few that I like to cite here, that allowing people to vote by mail would result in widespread fraud, citing concerns with ballot harvesting and hundreds of people sitting in their living rooms just filling out ballots. The fact of the matter is, there's just nothing to base this claim on. Voter fraud in general is incredibly rare in the United States. Vote by mail states also continue to have some of the most secure elections in the country and report an exceedingly low amount of fraud cases. So let me say that again. Voter fraud in the United States is infinitesimally small, whether it's in person or by mail ballot / absentee ballot. It is not a major concern here in the United States. So there are a few reasons for this. One, identity verification, so providing sensitive personal identifying information to obtain their ballot or envelope, right? Signature verification process, voter-specific barcodes on each ballot envelope, ballot tracking systems, secure drop boxes, post-election audits, and finally, polling sites as a fail-safe. So talking about the myth of voter fraud and disinformation around voting by mail. Let's take Oregon as an example. So Oregon, who has conducted their elections by mail since 2000, has sent out more than 100 million ballots and only documented about a dozen cases of proven fraud. That is less than 0.00001% of all votes cast. A different analysis found that in all states between 2000 to 2012, only 491 cases of absentee ballot fraud had occurred. Again, infinitesimally small. Another claim that is often thrown around regarding disinformation with voting by mail is that allowing people the access to cast ballots by mail disproportionately helps Democrats. And if we allow people to vote by mail, then Republicans will never win another election. There's also no basis to this claim, as both Democratic Republican election officials support these systems, right? So Kim Wyman, who is the Secretary of State for Washington State, is a Republican and a huge proponent of voting by mail, as is Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland, who supports voting by mail. Utah, a historically red state, has also been using universal vote by mail for a number of years now, and they're a pretty red state. And so it's obviously Republicans are winning races in Utah. In a recent study from the University of Florida called The Neutral Partisan Effects of Vote by Mail, Evidence from County Level Rollouts, researchers found that mail ballots did not seem to have an effect on either party's turnout, either party's vote share, and as I previously mentioned, that modest turnout increases are found whenever you increase the amount of ballots that are cast by mail. So again, I'm sure we will continue to see an unbelievable amount of disinformation and misinformation around voting by mail floating out there. But I want to say unequivocally here tonight that voter fraud in voting by mail and in person in any kind in the United States is infinitesimally small and is not a widespread concern here in the United States. People should be confident that their ballot will be counted and that it is safe and that it is secure. Okay, so we've talked about the impact that COVID-19 had on the primary elections and the concerns that it raised for election administrators. We've talked about vote by mail systems and what that means for the states that are actually administering them. And we've talked about misinformation and disinformation. So are we prepared for November? As of May 22nd, the Illinois legislature had passed Senate Bill 1863 Amendment 5, which contained a host of electoral reforms. These include Election Day as a state holiday for schools and state workers, which is a big benefit here as it gives election administrators the ability to open government buildings and schools for polling locations. Additionally, all eligible voters who have voted since 2018 or who newly registered to vote and update their registration information will be sent a vote by mail application automatically. It required the creation of a central online vote by mail application portal on the Illinois State Board of Elections website, which is up right now. It promotes voting by mail through a comprehensive public education program, and this is sort of where advocacy organizations like ours have really seen an opportunity to do work, is public education. It expanded early voting hours, so 15 days out from Election Day, mandated longer office hours for early voting locations, as well as gave election officials the ability to designate certain hours for certain at-risk groups, right? Which is a really unique thing, I think, whenever we're thinking about giving people as many options, as many safe options as possible to cast their ballot in November. Polling locations must follow Illinois Department of Public Health guidelines. It emphasizes the recruitment of younger election judges, including advertising in high schools, community colleges, and universities, and also promotes curbside voting and the use of collection sites, also known as drop boxes. So a really great bill that was passed here in Illinois, and I think puts us in a really good situation leading up to November. That being said, it doesn't contain everything that we're concerned about as advocates, right? In particular, language access provisions aren't explicitly stated, and so there are also no specific provisions that limit the ability of local election officials to shrink election day footprints, which means the amount of physical polling locations on election day. But again, as advocates, we see our role as, in public education and working with election officials to make sure that, our elections in November are safe and secure and accessible, and that everyone has the ability to cast their ballot in the way that they so choose. It's also finally important to note here that all of these reforms in 1863 sunset as of January 1st, 2021. But I think this leaves the door open for us to look at the results of the election, how expanded vote by mail worked in the state of Illinois, and gives us the opportunity to advocate for electoral reforms far past November. So we'll see how that goes. So that's Illinois. What's happening at the federal level? So the big concern from the federal level, or where advocates thought the federal government would play a role, is in funding, right? After the primaries and thinking about how you ramp up vote by mail infrastructure, one of the top concerns on election officials' mind was money. We're going to need to hire more election workers. We're going to need to pay for paper. We're going to need to buy high-speed ballot sorters and processors and upgrade our current infrastructure to make sure that we can handle this increased volume of absentee ballots. So part of this came in the, if you remember in March when the CARES Act was signed into law, that included $400 million in Help America Vote Act emergency funds made available to states to prepare for the coronavirus during the 2020 cycle. I should also note here that experts were telling us back then that we actually need about $4 billion in funding nationally to adequately fund our elections across the country. Obviously, we have not gotten that. But so that was sort of where people saw the federal government and Congress really playing a role. Now, there's been for a couple, I think, months now, sort of talk of a CARES Act 2 with another influx of dollars for election officials, but we're still waiting to see what Congress does with another COVID relief package. So more to come on that. The other thing at the federal level that has been of most interest recently would be the United States Postal Service. So what is going on with the United States Postal Service? Similar to misinformation and disinformation, if you have read the news at all or have been on social media, you've likely heard something about the Postal Service. At its core, the United States Postal Service is designed to be a public service, right? People depend on it for their medications, their paychecks, businesses depend on it for commerce. It's ingrained into our everyday lives. So when attacks are levied against the Postal Service in an attempt to undermine voter confidence about the validity of this year's election, it's incredibly concerning. As I'm sure you've been following, the Postal Service is in a dire financial situation. Now, the origins of this actually go back to 2006 when Congress passed the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act, requiring the Postal Service to create a $72 billion fund to pay for the cost of its post-retirement healthcare costs 75 years into the future. This burden applies to no other federal agency or private corporation. It's a wildly unnecessary burden on the Postal Service, which has, again, led to the dire financial situation we find ourselves in today. So fast forward to 2020, through a long battle to privatize the Postal Service, and we arrive to the Postal Service combating COVID-19, an increase in packages sent through mail, and Postmaster Louis DeJoy, who continually, up until about a week and a half ago, instituted measures meant to cut back on costs, when in reality, they just disrupted nationwide mail delivery. These included eliminating overtime for postal workers, limiting the number of mail trucks that were in use, and removing hundreds of sorting machines from facilities. Trump himself has made multiple threats to hold back funding to limit mail voting. Nothing about this is subtle. It's just as brazen as it sounds. So as of August 18th, DeJoy did announce that any new policies were being suspended between now and November to avoid the look of his office attempting to influence the Postal Service's ability to facilitate vote by mail systems. But make no mistake, the Postal Service is under a very real threat. So I want to emphasize here again, the USPS is essential not only to the everyday running of the country, but also in allowing Americans to safely and securely vote this fall. Again, 5 states and the military have been utilizing extensive / universal mail voting for years. And so don't believe the disinformation that says it isn't secure. It absolutely is. So what should be done? In a new COVID relief package, Congress needs to fund the Postal Service. Some estimates say a $25 billion price tag is the right amount. The arbitrary changes in workplace policy also need to end, as they directly impact the ability of mail to be delivered in a timely fashion. So call your elected officials in DC, sign petitions, and just get the word out that we have to defend the United States Postal Service. So that's the federal level. How does it affect you? So there are a couple different buckets that people fall into, right? First, if you voted in an election from 2018 to 2020, you should have had your ballot application, automatically mailed to you. Those went out on August 1st. That being said, we were also encouraging people to request their ballot application early, as were election officials across the state and across the country. If you fall into the category of someone who has not voted between 2018 and 2020, you will have to submit, or you'll have to go to your election authority's website to submit a ballot application. There are a few options here. Again, you can either go to your election authority's website, so county clerk's office or Board of Elections website, and submit the application, or you can use the portal that the Illinois State Board of Elections has created that will guide you to your election authority's website. If you aren't registered to vote right now, or you need to update your registration information, your registration can serve as your application for a mail-in ballot. It's my understanding that people who register and update their information will have the option to check a box declaring that they want to apply for their ballot. Additionally, the Secretary of State's office will follow up with those who have received their mail ballot application but have not yet submitted it. There are, I believe, 2 different follow-ups for this. One is in the middle of September and another in the middle of October. So there are a lot of moving parts in how they're encouraging people to cast their vote in November. So that's a few different universes of voters, right? Regardless of the universe that you fall into, once you've submitted your ballot application, ballots will begin to get mailed out about 40 days before Election Day. That date is September 24th. So how about return methods? The first is obviously mailing your ballot back to the election authority. What we've seen around the country is that election authorities want people to either request or mail in their ballot ahead of time. They're going to need extra time to process the increased capacity or the increased volume and mail-in ballots in their offices. And so the earlier you can get your stuff in, the better. Depending on what your county or Board of Elections decides to do to prepare for November, there might also be the opportunity to return your ballot via secure Dropbox. In DuPage County, this is an option, which we'll talk about in the next slide. Finally, in-person options are still available. This is really important, again, as we had said. So one of the reasons that we keep emphasizing the need to have in-person options for voting is there are some populations in the United States that, or some population communities that are just more inclined to vote in person. Maybe it's a tradition, right? Of waking up in the morning and dropping your kids off at school and going to the polling place and casting your ballot and then continuing your day. Or maybe there is just a lack of trust with the Postal Service and how vote by mail systems work in the United States. So this is the reason that you have to have in-person voting options. Early voting hours have been extended for the general election, and election day voting will still be happening. Again, Illinois Department of Public Health guidelines will be mandated at each polling location, but locations and times should be available on your county clerk or Board of Elections website starting mid-September. So that information, if it hasn't already been put up, at least in a preliminary aspect, will be coming officially by the middle of the month. So, drop boxes and early voting for DuPage County. This graphic is actually taken from the Chicago Tribune. They have this great mapping tool for the city of Chicago and the collar counties of where drop boxes have been announced that they will become early voting on election day. So in DuPage County, you'll have multiple drop boxes. It's, from my understanding, on the county clerk's website that each drop box will be housed within an early voting location, right? So you'll have them in the election authority's office as well as the, I think it's 15 or so early voting locations in the county. Again, drop boxes are a very secure way to return your ballot and are emptied every day. As for early voting hours, early voting begins starting 40 days before election day, and that's at your election authority's office. Now, additional early voting locations do open, typically about mid-October, around the 19th. Select locations might be opening around October 7th. Again, that's something to go to your county clerk's website and verify there. That's the best place to go for any up-to-date information that you're looking for, is your county clerk or Board of Elections website, depending on where you live. I would also note here that within DuPage County, I mentioned the early voting locations. Again, you can also drop it off at the county clerk's election division office, as well as drop boxes located at the parking lot and main entrance of the Jack T. Nitfer Administration Building in Wheaton. So tons of different locations you can drop your ballot off if you don't have time to wait in line on election day, if you hit your ballot and just forget to submit it in time and don't feel comfortable thinking it'll get to the election official's office in time and you just feel better about dropping in a drop box. Tons of options in how to submit your ballot that are safe and secure and accessible. So, talked about systems, we've talked about different ways that you can submit your ballot. Let's talk about important dates between now and November 3rd. September 24th, in-person early voting begins and ballots that were requested by mail start to go out on September 24th. Now, it's important to note after September 24th, if you submit a ballot application, the election authority is theoretically supposed to mail that ballot to you within, I believe, 2 days of receiving your ballot application. So you can absolutely still apply for your mail ballot, and it should be turned around to you fairly quickly so that you can fill it out and resubmit it with plenty of time to spare, right? So that's September 24th. On October 18th, that is the last day for online voter registration. You can still register in person if you go to vote early or vote on election day, but just to flag that October 18th is the last day for online voter registration. October 29th, mailed-in applications must be received by your election authority. Again, I would very much encourage everyone to not wait until October 29th if you want to request a mail ballot. Again, election authorities time and time again have kept asking, please get your materials in on time, whether you're requesting your ballot or you're sending your ballot in. Get your materials in as soon as possible so that we have, so that there's plenty of time to process all these materials, and it eases the burden on election authorities and election judges, right? So October 29th, mailed-in applications must be received by your election authority. November 2nd, it's the last day to apply in person to vote by mail. And November 3rd, is Election Day. It's important to note here again that for mail ballots, if you are mailing it back, it has to be postmarked by Election Day. And I believe the deadline for having your mail ballot received by the election authority is 2 weeks after Election Day. But again, get your materials in early. That's the best way. That advocates and election officials have been constantly trying to hammer home is get your materials in early so that you know that it's received and everyone has confidence in the system. So action items. If any of the things that I've talked about have mildly concerned you, contact your congressperson and call your senators, right? Thinking of election funding moving into November, I am sure that election officials would love to still have a massive influx of cash. So we need our elections to be funded federally. Another important thing, check your registration status, and if you haven't yet, request a ballot. If you go to the Illinois State Board of Elections website, you can do all of this there. And again, they have the universal portal where you can follow it to your election authority's website and then request your mail ballot. So be sure to do that. Contact your election authority. If you're concerned about the amount of drop boxes, whether it's you don't think there are enough drop boxes or you want to ask about curbside voting, whether that's a possibility for the fall, contact your election authority. They, again, are the best source of information on all of these issues and can give you the most up-to-date information and answer all your questions that you could possibly have about the election system leading up to November. Two other things from a common cause perspective. One, if you're interested in all the things I've been talking about and want to volunteer, we have a program called Election Protection that we are rolling out for November 3rd. What we do is by utilizing volunteers, we are going to establish a virtual poll monitoring program. So we will give our volunteers plenty of training on how you serve as a social media monitor and how to monitor your local election authorities. Website for soon to be released or changing information. But again, we're recruiting virtual poll monitors to help us monitor the election from the safety of your own home. Typically, it's an in-person on-the-ground program, but obviously with the COVID-19 reality, we realize that's not feasible. So again, a virtual poll monitoring program, we're really excited to roll it out. And if you're interested in volunteering, it's going to be a great way to get involved through the rest of the year. And finally, one of the big things that we have focused on as an advocacy organization is public education. So write a letter to the editor for your local paper. You've probably seen tons of these, but again, we're battling a lot of different sources of misinformation and disinformation. Getting your voice out there saying, vote by mail is a safe way to vote. I'm going to cast my ballot by mail. Showing public support is really important in making sure that people feel confident in casting their ballot by mail, right? So if you're interested and have the time, write a letter to the editor to your local paper to talk about why Illinois is prepared for November and why voting by mail is safe, secure, and accessible. Okay, so finished up a little early there, but that's okay. So we talked about a lot, right? We talked about how elections were impacted by COVID-19. We talked about vote by mail as a system, what different states do across the country. We talked about, state policy and how Illinois is going to be prepared for November. We've talked, concerns at the federal level, whether it be funding and the Postal Service. And finally, the voter experience and what you can expect to experience when you go to cast your ballot by mail through early voting or voting in person on Election Day. So let's go ahead and turn to questions, and we'll dive into any questions that you have. I know I saw the chat box pop up a few different times. And let me stop sharing my screen. Okay.
So the question in the chat box was, is there a distinction between voter fraud and election fraud? For example, all the mail-in ballots are valid, but they somehow get shoved in a pile in a corner, never to be seen again.
Gotcha. So I think both of those terms sort of encompass the same thing, right? You're just framing them a little bit differently. Yeah, I don't know if I would say there's necessarily a distinction between, I think voter fraud is probably the broader term actually, in terms of whether it's, you know, someone attempting to vote twice or someone who illegally bundles ballots like we saw in the New Jersey primary for a municipal election. So no, I don't think there's a substantive difference between the terms voter fraud and election fraud. I think they tend to encompass different things. It might just be a difference in framing on whether you're talking about individuals or, you know, systems not working, but they tend to sort of talk about the same things. But again, I would be remiss if I didn't say, you know, voter fraud, election fraud, however you want to frame it, is infinitesimally small here in the United States, whether in person or by mail. Again, study after study after study has shown us that this is not, one, it's not a widespread concern. It never has. It hasn't been at the level that people claim it has been. And people should feel safe and secure and comfortable submitting their ballot by mail. So again, I just want to highlight that misinformation and disinformation about vote by mail or voting by mail not being safe is untrue. It's not based in any sort of reality. And objectively, voting by mail is a safe, secure, and accessible way for all voters to cast their ballot in November. Are there any other questions for me?
Feel free to use the chat, or if you hover at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A that you can click. We also have a voters corner on the Downers Grove website that has some of the information there, including the links to the Election Commission in DuPage that Tyler was talking about. Anyway, but there is another question. And she asks, sorry, you had a slide that says in-person voting starts September 24th. Where would one vote in person on that date?
So early voting opens at your election authority's office on that date, right? So the DuPage County Clerk's Elections Division office. Now, additional early voting locations will open, but that doesn't happen typically until October. But again, the county clerk's website is the best place to find all this information. But on September 24th, that is your county clerk's elections office. And I would also I'll also highlight that for your county clerk's election office, I would check. I know some government services are by appointment only. I don't think that would apply here, obviously. Again, I can't hammer this enough. Just make sure for any other questions that you have, always check your county clerk's or Board of Elections website, depending on where you live. They are absolutely the best source for up-to-date election information, whether you're having questions about vote by mail or early voting, like you just asked here, or, you know, where are the polling locations going to be on election day? How can I serve as an election judge? Always be sure to check your county clerk's or Board of Elections webpage. It has the most up-to-date information, and they are doing an incredible job preparing us for November. Any other questions?
We actually have a question about what is the county clerk's website, and so I'm going to post it in the chat. If there's any other information you can include on that while I'm looking it up.
Sure. So yeah, there are two main areas I would go for any sort of elections information. If you're going to an official source, it'd be the State Board of Elections website, or again, specifically your county clerk's website. And specifically will be under like an elections division or election offices tab. But again, this is a great website to go to check your registration status. It's the website. So Karen just posted it in the chat. Check your registration status, to check your early voting locations and the dates that they open. It's where you can go to check the in-person polling places on election day, to submit your ballot application. It's a one-stop shop for everything elections related here in Illinois leading up to the general on November 3rd. Any other questions for me? Okay, that sounds like all of them. So I just want to say again, a big thank you to Karen and the Downers Grove Public Library, as well as everybody for joining us tonight. I one, appreciate you taking an hour out of your evening to spend it with me to talk about incredibly dense election information. This is something I really love doing, so it's easy for me, but I appreciate everyone taking the hour to join us this evening and for the thoughtful and great questions. There have been so many questions swirling around about what we're going to do for November, where we find ourselves now. I think we're in a really good spot. But again, checking your registration status, getting your information in, or getting your application in early. Once you get your ballot, getting that in early, and following the advice of election administrators in the state. They're working really hard against impossible circumstances. But again, they're sort of the stewards of democracy, and they are, again, a one-stop shop for any additional questions, comments, or concerns you may
have. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It is being recorded, and probably in about a week, it'll be up on our website. I posted earlier, we do have a voters corner on the website, as well as resources at the library. Things like the sample ballots usually aren't released until mid-September, September 24th. Is that so? Just be patient. They are coming, and we will have them there so you can take a look at them. So again, thank you very much for coming, and you go out and enjoy the rest of this evening. Thank you very much for Tyler for coming out and joining us this evening. And everybody,
thank you very much. It was great to be here.
Good night, everyone.